Today we're going to be taking a look at an absolutely fascinating game played by the greatest chess goat of them all, pardon my redundancy, Robert James Fischer, who in the game you're about to witness had just come off about an 18-month hiatus from serious tournament play. He'd just been kind of laying low, quietly growing stronger, and becoming the greatest chess-playing entity to ever walk the face of the earth, if he wasn't already. But now he's ready to get back into the thick of it. The year is 1970, and he's up against the fearsome ex-world champion Tigran Petrosian. And believe it or not, Bobby Fischer is actually a bit nervous. He later wrote in a letter to Grandmaster Walter Brown that before this game he was feeling a bit unsure of himself since he hadn't played in a while. But when he saw Petrosian's face, he suddenly felt reassured. He said Petrosian looked scared, and he knew why. According to Fischer, it was because Petrosian had been slandering him, denigrating his character and his chess-playing ability, and as Fischer put it, quote, lying his head off. The implication being that Petrosian knew that Fischer was about to put him in his place. Now, what exactly Petrosian said about Fischer, I don't know. I couldn't find any quotes. I do know that in general, the Russians considered Fischer to be quite conceited and arrogant, because he kind of was. But anyway, let's see what kind of punishment Bobby Fischer is able to dole out on the great defender Tigran Petrosian for all of his supposed smack-talking. Fischer has the white pieces, and he opens with e4, a move that he called best by test, which translates to best because I'm the best and it's my favorite move. Petrosian responds c6, the Caro-Kann, an opening that gave Fischer a bit of trouble early on in his career when he didn't have a great track record against it, but by this time he'd long since figured out how to deal with it, and he now continues with the most popular and probably the strongest move, d4, attaining that dream pawn center, as one tends to do whenever feasible. Petrosian attacks it right away with the main move, d5. We have e takes d5, the exchange variation, c takes d5, and now bishop to d3 from Fischer, preventing bishop to f5 and bishop to g4, both of which would have been possible if he had instead played the more normal-looking knight to f3. So he's playing to restrict Petrosian's light-squared bishop here. Play continues knight to c6, attacking d4, c3 defends, knight to f6, and now bishop to f4. Fischer continues to wait on playing knight to f3. He would of course love it if Petrosian played e6, shutting out his light-squared bishop in order to develop the dark-squared bishop and castle, but Petrosian plays a much better move, bishop to g4, attacking the queen, inviting Fischer to weaken his kingside with f3. But he knows better than that and instead plays queen to b3, attacking the pawn on b7, which now could be defended with queen to d7 or queen to c8. The dark squares are of course off limits because of this bishop on f4, but Petrosian goes for knight to a5, defending with the knight while simultaneously attacking the queen. Fischer says that's okay, I have queen to a4 with check, and now you gotta move one of your minor pieces backwards. Blocking with the queen would of course lose the knight on a5, so we have bishop to d7 hitting the queen again. Fischer retreats it to c2, and now we have e6, shutting that kingside door on the light squared bishop, activating the dark squared bishop. The engine is not impressed. It's saying that g6 would have been a bit better, but Petrosian's position is solid enough, and he's got some things he can do. Play continues knight to f3, and now comes queen to b6, looking to trade off that rather passive bishop on d7, but do you think Fischer's going to allow bishop to b5? Heck no, he plays a4. Of course, this does open the b3 square for business, but filling that hole with either queen or knight doesn't really get black anywhere. If knight to b3, then after rook to a2, the knight is just kind of firing blanks without really much else to do, while the queen is tied down to its defense. If queen to b3, then after queen to e2, it's kind of the same story. If knight to c4, then white can just play bishop to c1, defending b2, and again, black doesn't really have a good follow-up. Now, in case anyone is wondering about grabbing a pawn here with bishop takes a4, well, this fails spectacularly to rook takes a4, queen takes a4, and bishop to b5 check, winning the black queen. In the game, Petrosian very wisely stays out of b3 and instead plays rook to c1, putting his rook opposite the white queen, generally a good thing to do, also supporting a possible knight to c4. Fischer responds knight b to d2, hitting that square with another minor piece. Now if knight to c4, he can take with the bishop, and after d takes c4, jump into e5 with his knight, attacking the pawn with the second piece, which black will have to awkwardly defend with queen to a6. Not good times. Petrosian, seeing that his knight no longer has any future on a5, decides to move it back to c6, now threatening to come into b4, forking white's queen and bishop due to the pin on the c3 pawn, which may not capture the knight lest white loses queen. Fischer takes notice and vacates the file with queen to b1. Petrosian plays knight to h5, giving the other bishop a little probing now. Fischer puts it on e3, at which point we have a significant error with h6, a needlessly weakening move and sort of a waste of time. What Petrosian was concerned about after a move like queen to c7 was, of course, bishop takes h7, winning the pawn. Now, you wouldn't want to try to trap the bishop with g6, because then after bishop takes g6, white's going to get 2 more pawns for the piece with a very nasty attack on the black king. But what you can play is knight to f4, attacking g2 while adding defense to g6. So bishop takes knight is best, and after queen takes f4, black is handsomely compensated for the pawn. He's got attacking prospects with g5 and g4, the opened file for his rook, the bishop pair, so no advantage here for white at all. In the game, however, Petrosian plays his overly defensive h6, and this gives Fischer the chance to play knight to e5, a move that wouldn't have been possible if queen to c7 had been played instead of h6, assuming that white doesn't want to lose a pawn for no good reason. Now Petrosian would love to just be able to remove that knight with knight takes e5, but after d takes e5, white would be threatening to both win the black queen and to play g4, attacking and trapping the knight on h5, which has run out of squares. Black could try bishop to c5, but all I'm going to tell you about that is that it fails to the move a5, and you can work the rest out from there if you want. What's played is knight back to f6, and now it's Fischer's turn to play an inaccurate move, and it's actually an exact mirroring of the mistake Petrosian made. He pushes his pawn to h3. Okay, he's supporting g4, he wants to get a kingside pawn storm going, but as usual, the engine has some things to say about it. And what it says is that black should have no problem weathering the pawn storm, and that white should have instead gone for maximum central domination with moves like knight to f3 and bishop to f4 after castling, just to give maximum support to that beautiful steed on e5. From a human perspective, though, you can't really criticize h3 too harshly. It is kind of scary looking, and it does indeed prove to be too difficult for Petrosian to deal with. He starts out okay though, with bishop to d6, very sensible, increasing pressure on e5, Fischer castles. Black still can't take on e5 since after the recapture, white would be attacking both the knight on f6 and the queen. So what black should do now is play something like queen to c7, or he can even just castle. Petrosian said later that he did consider this, but that he didn't know what he could do to counter the attack after the move g4. Now, I don't know what specific sequence of moves he was looking at, but after something like queen to c7, f4 supporting g5, and then this computer move, knight to e7, white's position is looking pretty nice, but he doesn't have anything that black can't deal with. g5 can be met with h takes g5, and then after f takes g5, bishop takes knight on e5 is the move. Now, if you take on f6, then the bishop recaptures, and black is actually the winning side. So best is d takes e5, but then comes knight to e4, and after bishop takes e4 and d takes e4, if white takes with the knight, then black can grab the pawn on e5, and if queen takes e4 defending, then bishop to c6 with tempo on the queen gives black very nice compensation for white's extra pawn, cutting right through white's decimated kingside with his now very powerful bishop. So there's our token engine line of the game. Let's get back to reality though, where after Fischer castles, Petrosian plays a very bad move, king to f8, giving Fischer a totally winning position. And it's not hard to believe. He's given up the right to castle, he's put his king on the same file as this rook on f1, which might not seem too important at the moment, but there are some variations where it becomes significant. This weird looking king move does have some logic to it though, the idea being to drop the bishop back to e8 to provide defense to f7, which has the potential to be a very weak point in black's position, as we're soon going to see. Now what do you think white's best move is here? Fischer plays f4, just focusing on the kingside assault, but c4 would have been much more crushing, threatening c5 and ready to meet d takes c4 with d5, uncovering an attack on the black queen. That would be no fairy tale ending for black. Unless we're talking Brothers Grimm, of course. But after this move f4, we do have bishop to e8 as planned. Now the astute viewer may have noticed that the pawn on d4 is now pinned to the undefended bishop on e3 by the queen. However, black could not have won material by capturing twice on e5, since white could just throw in the move a5 at the right moment, driving the black queen away before making the recapture on e5. Now again, c4 is the most decisive move for white here, but Fischer plays bishop to f2, looking to reroute to h4 to apply some pressure to the knight on f6. For him, it's all about the king side. We have queen to c7, increasing pressure on e5, Petrosian knows that f5 is on the cards, and so he's preparing to take out the knight on e5 as soon as it's played. Next is bishop to h4 as planned, and now another mistake, knight to g8. Now I'm not totally sure what Petrosian was thinking with this move, whether he was anticipating the actual variation played in the game, where his bishop ends up on f6, a square that wouldn't have been available otherwise, but this is a totally losing move, and it's not surprising since it's about as ugly as they come. The best move was actually knight back to h5 with the idea of taking on f4 and then following up with a quick g5 forking rook and bishop. Now it's at this point that the usefulness of having a bishop on e8 comes into play, since otherwise white could play bishop to g6 here attacking f7, and if the pawn takes the bishop, then knight to g6 with check would pick up the rook. Of course that's not possible here since the bishop is defending. Fischer now plays f5, the knight is captured, and after d takes e5, Petrosian is able to grab the pawn on e5. However, Fischer gets the pawn right back with f takes e6, taking advantage of the pin on the f7 pawn, which may not recapture. And this move would have come with an attack on the knight if Petrosian had moved it to d7 earlier instead of g8, so it could be that he had calculated this line, where he is now able to play bishop to f6, challenging the bishop on h4. Fischer throws in e takes f7, counter-attacking two minor pieces, and after bishop takes f7, he does not play bishop takes f6, which would just help black get his knight back into the game, but rather knight to f3 defending. We have a trade of bishops, and knight to f6, at which point you might think that black has a decent chance of survival. The material is equal, Fischer's pawn storm is petered out, but black is pretty flippin' far from okay here. His king is still quite vulnerable, as we're going to see. His rook is shut out of the game, not to mention his weak and isolated pawn on d5. Fischer continues with a strong move, knight to g6 check, forking king and rook, and so forcing Petrosian to part with his bishop. And after bishop takes g6, black has a big problem. How is he ever getting this rook into the game? His king can't go to f7 or to h7 as long as white's bishop is hanging out on g6. There's no way to make it move. So Petrosian does the only thing that he can do. He steps onto the open file with king to e7. And for any of you watching that are new to chess, this is not typically a sign that things are going well. In a position like this, with the queen still on the board, along with the rooks and this open file, you really want your precious king tucked away in the corner of the board, not marching out into the front lines. Fischer responds queen to f5, and here my idea was, why not play rook to d8, followed by king back to f8? Well, this runs into problems due to the pin on the f6 knight. The engine's giving bishop to h5 with the idea of playing queen to h7 and then coming into h8. That would be utter devastation. What Petrosian tries is king to d8. We have rook a to e1, queen to c5 check, king to h1, and now rook to f8, finally completing the kingside development. Fischer plays queen to e5. We have rook to c7, clearing the way for the king to potentially run to the corner of the board. But Fischer's having none of that. He plays b4, attacking the queen. It goes to c6, and now comes c4, naturally attacking the d-pawn, which is not adequately defended as the knight on f6 is currently pinned to the rook. Petrosian tries d takes c4, but after bishop to f5, cutting off the black king's escape, what is to be done about rook to d1 check? Somebody's going to have to block. Even if you move the rook on f8 somewhere so you can do it with the knight, then white is either going to end up capturing the pawn on g7 with the queen, or trading on d7 and then invading the b8. Either way, the black position is collapsing. Petrosian tries rook f to f7, so that after rook to d1 check, now played by Fischer, he can block with the rook. This is, of course, a sacrifice of the exchange, which Fischer now accepts with bishop takes d7, and after rook takes d7, here comes that queen to b8 with check. Now as black, you might be tempted to block with the queen. However, this would lose the queen to rook takes d7 check, king takes d7, and rook to d1 check, driving the king away from her defense. What's played is king to e7, but after rook d to e1 check, it's time to resign. So Petrosian does just that, seeing that his only way to avoid a rapid mate would be to sacrifice his queen with queen to e6. Playing king to f7 would of course run into queen to e8 checkmate. If you block with the knight, then there's queen to f8 check, king to e6, and queen to f5 check, followed by the winning of the knight with rook takes e4, and according to our beloved Stockfish, in whom we place our unquestioning faith and trust, mate in another 8 moves. So there it is, my fellow wood pushers. If you indeed push wood, I like the feel of a good wood set. Of course, my dream chess set is made out of woolly mammoth ivory. Maybe someday I'll have it. It's only 13 grand. Could be worse. But let me know what you thought of this game. Feel free to suggest whatever game you'd like to see me cover next. I don't always have time to respond, but I will take note and I just might cover it. As usual, thanks so much for watching. Please consider subscribing to the channel to see more content like this on the regular. Leave a like, leave a comment. Those things always help the channel grow, and I will see you next time.